They had braced themselves for animosity, distrust, and an unceasing reminder of their status as prisoners of war. However, upon the arrival of the initial trucks at the American Midwest farmlands, the German POWs were greeted by expansive vistas of corn, wheat, and soybean plantations. The stark contrast saw scattered farmhouses replacing the barbed wire and watchtowers of the camps with limitless skies, the aroma of freshly cultivated earth, and the faint sounds of children's laughter emanating from nearby barns. The serenity of rural America felt like entering an entirely different realm for those who had traversed war-torn European villages. The journey from the camps to the farms had already perplexed a considerable number of them. They were unrestrained by handcuffs, and the guards treated them with a detached air of indifference rather than overt cruelty. Some prisoners exchanged hushed whispers, questioning why Americans would permit enemy combatants to toil in their fields without persistent armed supervision. Their awareness of America's need for agricultural labor was clear. The exodus of numerous young men to the war front had relegated agricultural duties to the elderly, the very young, and women. Nevertheless, the notion of farmers entrusting individuals who had once wielded rifles against their offspring remained difficult to comprehend. Upon the truck's arrival, farmers extended simple nods as greetings. These were not individuals driven by vengeance. They sought assistance. Shovels, hoes, and wagons awaited, and the prisoners were guided towards rows of crops that extended endlessly toward the horizon. The POWs swiftly observed that the farmers dispensed with lengthy speeches or stern warnings. The work demanded completion, and in those initial hours spent in the fields, the Germans discerned that they were regarded less as perilous captives and more as supplementary pairs of hands. As the sun ascended higher in the sky, the POWs bent their backs to the tasks, eliminating weeds, gathering hay, and aiding in the loading of produce-filled baskets. For numerous individuals, it represented their initial experience since capture of experiencing something akin to regular labor, a departure from the mechanical camp drills or the burden of carrying rations under surveillance. Here, there was perspiration, dust, and the unceasing cadence of farm life. It evoked memories of their homelands, of small Bavarian or Saxon villages where their fathers had once cultivated the land. The sense of disbelief intensified with the arrival of midday. Their expectations included being escorted back to a truck, receiving bread and watery soup, and undergoing another head count before returning to the fields. Instead, a farmer's wife emerged, carrying baskets filled with sandwiches and jars of chilled lemonade, which she placed near the workers. The prisoners exchanged bewildered glances, questioning whether the food was intended for them. A guard shrugged and gestured for them to partake. With a sense of hesitation, they reached for the sandwiches. Generous slices of ham and cheese were nestled between soft white bread, a treat many had not savored since before the war. For the first time, the Germans came to understand that these farmers did not perceive them as monstrous figures. They were undeniably enemy soldiers, but also young men situated far from their homes, grappling with hunger and exhaustion. The meal was not extravagant, yet it carried a significance of kindness that they had not anticipated. Each mouthful possessed a flavor that transcended mere sustenance, conveying the peculiar sensation of dignity. The inaugural day concluded with fatigued arms, aching backs, and the scent of soil clinging to their garments. As the trucks commenced their return journey towards the camp, the POWs remained silent, each man internally reliving the day's occurrences. None could entirely believe what had transpired. The Americans had granted them access to their fields, collaborated alongside them, and nourished them as if they were not adversaries at all. This marked merely the inception of a protracted, unsettling realization that life in captivity could unveil instances of humanity, even amidst the throes of war. Subsequent mornings dawned early, frequently preceding the sun's complete ascent above the horizon. The echoing rumble of trucks entering the farms evolved into a familiar auditory experience for the German POWs. Initially, numerous individuals had approached these journeys with trepidation, anticipating exposure to harsher tasks or expressions of animosity from civilians. However, in the aftermath of the first day, The routine gradually transformed into something they could anticipate with diminished apprehension. While laboring in the fields remained physically demanding, it encompassed a rhythm that served as a reminder of the lives they had once led prior to the war. Each farm presented its unique set of demands. Certain farms were devoted to wheat and corn cultivation, featuring expansive fields that stretched so far that individuals could scarcely perceive their boundaries. Other farms engaged in livestock rearing, requiring prisoners to transport feed, sanitize barns, or attend to herds of cattle and pigs. For individuals who had once marched in uniform and wielded rifles, the heft of a pitchfork or the grip of a hoe felt strangely grounding. It connected them to the land much more profoundly than their camp's barracks ever could. Initially, the agriculturalists were not very talkative. A lot of them used basic body language, indicating equipment, rows of vegetation, and wagons that needed to be filled. The Germans, for their part, acknowledged with head nods and silent work. Despite the language differences, the needs of the land were adequately clear. As time went on, the farmers started noticing how diligent certain prisoners were. One was skilled at swinging an axe, another stacked hay in a tidy manner, while others took care when handling animals. The expertise they had developed in their German villages resurfaced, and surprisingly, the prisoners found they were proud of how well they were doing their jobs. The amount of trust the Americans showed was perhaps the biggest shock. Although guards were around, they frequently stayed in the background, watching casually from afar instead of constantly monitoring them. Farmers themselves often acted as supervisors, and even they didn't seem afraid in many situations. Some prisoners of war noticed that the smaller farms had no fences, walls, or attempts to limit their movement beyond the fields. The thought of escaping must have occurred to some of them. But where could they possibly go? The idea of escape kept them in place due to being thousands of miles from their homeland, surrounded by people who would immediately recognize them as outsiders. The midday meals became a sort of tradition. The farmers' wives would sometimes bring baskets to the edge of the fields filled with simple but filling foods like cornbread, hard-boiled eggs, sausages, and apples from the orchard. Other times, the food would be set out under a tree where the farmers and prisoners of war could take a break together in the shade. While it wasn't exactly equality, it was something unexpected. The removal of the strict limitations that the prisoners had believed would define every aspect of their imprisonment. The German soldiers couldn't help but compare this treatment to what they had envisioned. A lot of them had been influenced by Nazi propaganda that portrayed Americans as cruel and arrogant, and they were told that capture meant humiliation and hardship. But here they were, working hard alongside the very people they had been told to hate, and being given food that was much better than what German civilians were getting back home. Some prisoners were ashamed when they thought about their families struggling under Allied bombing and waiting in ration lines, while they were being offered fresh milk and bread in a foreign country. Conversations started little by little, frequently in imperfect English or with made-up gestures. Farmers would point to tools and say what they were called. Prisoners would repeat the names, learning bits of a new language. In turn, the Germans would sometimes sing work songs, tunes that carried across the fields. Some American workers recognized the melodies as being similar to their own folk songs, rhythms that were born out of work and connected to the land. These small interactions caused cracks in the wall of hostility, and even though distrust was still present, a strange sense of familiarity began to develop. Each evening, as the trucks drove back toward the camps, the men were tired but surprisingly satisfied. Their hands were covered in blisters, and their backs were sore, but they felt something they hadn't anticipated, a sense of purpose. It was this daily work, these long hours spent under the American sun, that would pave the way for an even bigger surprise, one that would happen not in the fields, but at the family dinner tables, where the distinctions between enemy and guest would become even less clear. The first invitation was offered somewhat hesitantly. At the end of a long day, a farmer, wiping sweat from his forehead, gestured toward his house, then at the German prisoners who had been working in his fields. At first, the men thought they had misunderstood. They assumed he was calling them back to the truck, or maybe asking them to get more tools before the day was over. But the meaning became clear when he gestured again, pointing straight to the farmhouse door and then to his own mouth. He was inviting them to have dinner with his family. The prisoners hesitated. Even the guards standing nearby seemed unsure, looking at the farmer as if questioning the wisdom of his gesture. The prisoners couldn't imagine stepping into an American home. They had been led to believe that civilians would treat them as enemies, possibly with outright hostility. But the farmer's expression was neither mocking nor intimidating. It was a simple, almost weary kindness, the kind of humanity that can arise when people work side by side. Inside the farmhouse, the German soldiers were welcomed by the aroma of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and potatoes simmering in butter. The kitchen table was a long and sturdy one, and it was already set with plates and cutlery for the family. The farmer's spouse gave a worried grin, evidently doubtful about inviting hostile warriors into her residence, but eager to heed her husband's direction. Kids peeked from the back of entryways, their gazes extensive with interest. The detainees stood uncomfortably to begin with, starting with one foot then onto the next, uncertain whether they should sit. Whenever the farmer removed a seat and motioned for them to join, the shock turned out to be complete. They were being provided not simply food, yet a seat at the family table, an honor far past what they at any point expected in imprisonment. The initial chomps were reluctant. A drumstick passed across the table, a crate of bread set down where they could get to it. Nobody talked much. The language boundary substantial in the air, however, the significance of the second was unquestionable. The adversary had been permitted to share the same feast as the family of their captors. For the Germans, the mental effect was significant. Back in Europe, the possibility of sitting at a table with regular folks of a rival country would have been unbelievable. In Nazi Germany, detainees and constrained workers were kept separated, took care of scraps, and regularly treated as not exactly human. Yet here in a calm corner of America, the specific inverse was unfurling. They were treated with an unforeseen nobility that sabotaged everything they had been told about the fierceness of the adversary. The dinners themselves were humble: meat, vegetables, milk, and sometimes a cut of pie for dessert. But to the PS, they were feasts. Each flavor reminded them of home. Broiled potatoes like their moms used to get ready. Bread delicate and warm from the oven. Meat prepared with spices they perceived. The demonstration of sharing food together made an unstable yet undeniable scaffold between two universes partitioned by war. Not every farmer broadened such solicitations. However, when the priority was set, stories spread rapidly among the detainees. They murmured in the quarters about dinners eaten at wooden tables, about discussions made with motions and faltering words, about the startling benevolence of ladies who offered them seconds of food. A few who had never been welcomed started to trust that one day their turn would come. Obviously, not every person approved. A few American neighbors mumbled about fraternizing with the adversary, and surprisingly some gatekeepers were uneasy. However, the farmers who welcomed the PS into their homes frequently guarded their activities basically. They buckled down. They're men like us. A feast will not change the conflict, yet it may change how we see one another. For the detainees, those words, spoken or suggested, resounded stronger than the thunder of far-off artillery. The initial solicitations were not just about food. They were about a break-framing in the mass of animosity. The Germans understood that no less than in these corners of America, the conflict didn't completely characterize what their identity was. For a brief moment every evening, they were not adversaries, not prisoners, but rather laborers sharing a table after a long day's work. It was a memory that would consume itself profound into their brains long after the conflict finished. The first time the German PSWs really sat at a family table, they felt the heaviness of both doubt and doubt squeezing vigorously upon them. The kitchen, loaded up with the glow of a night feast, was not normal for anything they had encountered since their catch. A straightforward wooden table extended across the room, previously packed with bowls of pureed potatoes, platters of fried chicken, sauce steaming in pitchers, and containers of warm bread. The farmer's better half moved nimbly between oven and table while the kids sat wide-eyed, looking between their folks and the outsiders in worn uniforms. The detainees sat stiffly, their hands collapsed firmly in their laps until the farmer gestured immovably, urging them to eat. From the outset, they took little segments, nearly embarrassed to contact food obviously ready for the family. However, soon the smell and taste defeated faltering. The chicken was delicate, the bread delicate, and the vegetables new from the very fields they had worked. Many of the men had gone years without such extravagance. In Germany, food was apportioned, and families endure on meager soups and scant meat. Here, the abundance of American farming was on complete presentation. Discussions, however restricted, started to stream in abnormal pieces. One detainee who had concentrated on English in school attempted to ask about the homestead creatures, pointing to the stable outside the window. The farmer chuckled, answering in slow words, rehashing them until the German comprehended. The kids, from the start modest, giggled at the bizarre accents of the visitors. One even slid his cut of pie across the table toward a young pea, murmuring consolation when the officer looked uncertain. That signal, guiltless and uncalculated, appeared to eradicate years of disdain more successfully than addresses at any point could. It was in these kitchen environments, under the glow of lamps and enveloped by the peacefulness of the American countryside, that the imprisoned soldiers started to recognize the paradoxical nature of the conflict. Just a few weeks before, they had been wearing the uniforms of individuals who had pledged to destroy this very nation. Now they found themselves consuming buttered mashed potatoes, served to them by the same people they had been told were heartless adversaries. The farmers' wives behaved towards them with care, yet without unkindness, offering additional servings, filling their glasses with milk, and reminding their children to pass the dishes with politeness. The German soldiers couldn't help but draw comparisons between these meals and the treatment of prisoners in Europe. Numerous individuals had heard accounts of Soviet prison camps where starvation and violence were a part of daily existence. Others recalled how foreign laborers in Germany had been compelled to eat separately from the local population, often receiving only scraps. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with American civilians consuming the same food felt not only unfamiliar but almost rebellious, as if reality itself was challenging the wartime propaganda. Of course, there were still underlying anxieties. Some of the prisoners harbored fears that such acts of kindness might be a deception, a tactic to make them feel secure and at ease. They ate with their eyes lowered, careful to avoid appearing unappreciative, but unable to dispel the feeling of unease. For the farmers as well, there was some hesitation, as inviting enemy soldiers into the home was not a decision to be taken lightly. Nonetheless, necessity and empathy appeared to outweigh any fear, and each meal concluded not with animosity, but with subdued nods and reluctant smiles. The evenings frequently ended with the prisoners assisting in clearing the table. They stacked dishes, carried pots back into the kitchen, or chopped firewood for the stove as a form of appreciation. Through those modest actions, both sides recognized something familiar: the routines of domestic life that existed independently of military uniforms and national flags. By the time the vehicles arrived to transport the prisoners of war back to the camp, there was a feeling that something meaningful had taken place. More than just dinner, but a mutual understanding of humanity that transcended the divisions of war. News of these meals quickly circulated throughout the camps. Those who had received invitations spoke about the deliciousness of fresh pie, the cheerful sound of children's laughter, and the comfortable atmosphere of an actual home. Others listened with feelings of longing, wondering if they too might someday have the chance to sit at an American table. Gradually, the thought began to take hold in their minds that the war was not the only narrative shaping their lives, and that moments of compassion could be discovered even within captivity. The shared meals soon grew into something beyond mere nourishment. They evolved into moments of unexpected cultural interchange. Around those farmhouse tables, the German prisoners of war were being exposed to an America that propaganda had never depicted. Each dinner unveiled not only an abundance of food, but also a lifestyle that was new to them, a relaxed familiarity among family members, and a casual openness that stood in sharp contrast to the strict, regimented order of life back home. The meals were consistent with the culinary patterns of the area. In the Midwest, there was corn on the cob dripping with butter, thick slices of roast beef, and large pieces of apple pie. In the South, it might be biscuits with gravy, fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet tea poured into tall glasses. To German prisoners used to the scarcity of resources during wartime, these were not just meals. They were like lavish feasts from another realm. Many had been raised on a diet of bread, potatoes, cabbage, and pork. While some of the flavors were familiar, others felt completely new. The sweetness of cornbread or the spiciness of chili left them astonished, exchanging surprised expressions as if they had stumbled upon a hidden treasure. But it wasn't just the food that surprised them. Conversation, at times hesitant, at times flowing more smoothly with the assistance of those who knew some English, began to create subtle connections between the two groups. The Germans talked about their villages, their farms back home, and the families they had left behind. They described fields of rye, forests of pine, and rivers where they had spent time fishing as boys. The Americans, in turn, shared narratives of their own lives, discussing how the war had taken their sons, how the harvests had suffered without the young men, and how the community had come together to keep the farms running. Children became unexpected communicators of goodwill. Curious and without fear, they asked simple questions that dissolved the formality of adult reserve. A young boy might point to a prisoner of war's calloused hands and ask if he too had milked cows. A young girl might giggle at the way a German struggled with an English word. These minor interactions held more significance than formal gestures of diplomacy. The sound of a child's laughter at the dinner table made it impossible to perceive the guests as nameless, faceless adversaries. Sometimes after supper, music became part of the gathering. A vintage photograph could be playing upbeat tunes like swing or jazz, sounds that were completely unknown to the German individuals. They would listen attentively, captivated by rhythms much more energetic than the patriotic tunes from their homeland. Occasionally, the prisoners of war reciprocated by offering something in return, singing a soft, quiet folk song in German, which would cause everyone in the room to become quiet. Although understanding the precise words was challenging, the sentiment was easily conveyed. The farmers would nod gradually, recognizing in the mournful melody an indication that the young men in front of them longed for a feeling of connection, just like anyone else, and were a long way from their homes. Cultural exchange was also facilitated through expressions of gratitude. Utilizing leftover wood from barns, some prisoners created small wooden toys for children. Others would fix tools or mend fences without being asked, showing their thanks for the hospitality they received by using the skills they possessed. The families remembered these actions and started referring to the prisoners of war by their names, Hans, Karl, or Wilhelm, instead of as nameless prisoners. They saw them as individuals with personal histories, rather than just soldiers in uniform. The Germans were constantly reminded of the conflicting nature of war every time they sat down for a meal. The very same American soldiers who were dropping bombs on their cities were now offering them portions of food and pieces of pie. This understanding deeply bothered them. It made it difficult to distinguish between who was an enemy and who was a friend. Within these ambiguous situations, they came to understand something that even the most rigorous military training couldn't eliminate: the understated acknowledgement of our shared human nature. When the prisoners went back to their camps at the end of each day, they frequently talked about what they had learned at the dinner table. They would talk about American traditions, try to figure out strange recipes, and sometimes laugh at misunderstandings that happened in the kitchens. The farmhouse dinners gradually evolved into unintentional cultural lessons, imparting information to the prisoners of war that they would remember long after the conflict was over. As the week progressed into months, the initial surprise of sitting at American tables gave way to more intimate, quieter instances of trust and human connection. The prisoners of war, who had originally been cautious and reserved, started to feel more at ease around the farm families. Every meal came with an unspoken understanding. For a brief period, the roles of captor and enemy were forgotten, and a relationship resembling friendly coexistence took their place. The strongest relationships started to take shape during these subtle interactions. After working in the fields for extended periods, some farmers welcomed the prisoners to stay after dinner, helping out with household tasks that went beyond their expected duties. Some individuals fixed broken fences with careful skill. Others chopped wood in preparation for the winter season, while some used their expertise to repair farm equipment. Nobody gave orders for these tasks. They were freely offered as small tokens of appreciation for the kindness they had been shown. The farmers took note, and as a result, their confidence increased. The children were essential in bridging the divide. They would grab the sleeves of the prisoners, requesting them to push them on swings, join informal games of catch, or create whistles from branches. The Germans, many of whom were young men in their 20s, reacted with unexpected tenderness, seemingly recalling younger family members they had left behind. A prisoner creating a small wooden horse for the farmer's son made the child happy for days, while another carefully repaired the loose wheel on a toy wagon. Although these actions seemed unimportant, they had a significance that words could never completely express. Trust also appeared in insignificant symbolic actions. Some farmers permitted the prisoners to stroll from the barn to the house unattended, a freedom unheard of in more controlled settings. A few even entrusted them with family treasures to fix, such as a clock, a chair, or a tool that had been handed down through the family. They were putting their faith in men who were previously considered enemies. The prisoners of war, knowing how important that trust was, responded with care and respect, frequently going above and beyond to show that they deserved it. The evenings would occasionally conclude with peaceful moments on porches where farmers and prisoners would sit together, drinking coffee or milk, as the fields stretched out in the darkness ahead. Although the language barrier remained, the silence was still meaningful. A mutual gaze at the horizon, a nod of shared weariness following a day of labor, or the soft melodies of a harmonica played by one of the Germans. All of these instances created a delicate sense of friendship. For the prisoners of war, these brief glimpses of regular life caused an emotional conflict that they couldn't ignore. The war was still being fought across the seas, and their families were going through bombings, shortages, and sorrow. Yet, in the middle of America, they were being offered moments of peace and stability. It was as if they had entered a different reality where kindness triumphed over violence. Many individuals later acknowledged that those encounters caused them to reevaluate everything previously taught regarding their adversaries. Of course, certain limitations existed. The guards still escorted the men back at night, and the camp regulations persistently reminded them of their status as prisoners. However, within those agricultural settings, the strictness diminished. Trust evolved into the unspoken value of everyday existence, exchanged not through extravagant displays, but through minor collaborative actions. Each meal, each mended implement, each moment of laughter shared with a child served as a seed planted in grounds that, in subsequent years, would evolve into enduring memories of humanity amidst the chaos of war. By the conclusion of each evening, as the trucks departed, the German soldiers carried with them more than satiated appetites. They bore a sense of dignity, having been treated not as nameless combatants, but as individuals possessing the capacity for kindness, labor, and even camaraderie. Those evenings would remain in their memories long after the conflict ended, serving as a reminder that even during the most severe conflicts, trust could still be cultivated. One shared meal, one shared task, one shared smile at a time. The sight of German detainees sharing meals at American tables was not universally embraced. To some neighbors, the scene was unsettling. The image of enemy combatants laughing with children, consuming pies and roasts, seemed to excessively obscure the moral distinction. Letters sporadically surfaced in local newspapers, accusing farmers of demonstrating leniency toward individuals who had once fought under Hitler's command. The strain was palpable. How extensive could compassion become before it appeared to be treachery? Camp officials also grappled with this inquiry. Officially, the Geneva Conventions mandated the humane treatment of prisoners of war, and America prided itself on upholding those regulations. However, permitting prisoners into family residences exceeded those guidelines. Some officers expressed concerns that fraternization could erode discipline. What if prisoners managed to escape under the guise of trust? What if locals grew overly sympathetic, overlooking the fact that these men had battled against their own sons overseas? Yet, despite these anxieties, instances of escape were infrequent. The detainees recognized the vastness of America, the challenge of assimilating, and the pointlessness of fleeing. For the majority, the prospect of a warm meal and genuine human interaction outweighed any imprudent thoughts. Neighbors, nonetheless, held differing viewpoints. Certain farmers admired the displays of kindness, asserting that mercy was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. They worked diligently, one man conveyed to a local publication. If we treat them like animals, we forfeit a part of ourselves. Others adopted a harsher stance, cautioning that such treatment dishonored the sacrifices made by American soldiers fighting abroad. Women who had lost husbands in Europe occasionally observed these suppers with resentment, finding it impossible to reconcile their sorrow with the notion of extending hospitality to the enemy. Even among the German prisoners of war, reactions varied. Those invited to meals frequently spoke of them in glowing terms, describing the warmth of the food and the unexpected humanity of the families. However, some detainees, still adhering to Nazi ideology, regarded the kindness with suspicion or disdain. They murmured in the barracks that the Americans were attempting to humiliate them by reducing them to beggars at foreign tables. Tensions occasionally erupted among the prisoners of war themselves, with some embracing the experience while others resented it. The farmers who opened their homes rarely offered public justifications. For them, the decision was as much practical as moral. They required the labor, and demonstrating kindness fostered trust and cooperation. Yet beneath that practicality resided something more profound, a silent conviction that decency did not need to be suspended during times of war. Around their tables, the world's divisions seemed momentarily less distinct, replaced by the simple human act of feeding the hungry. Officials eventually sought to establish limitations. In certain regions, rules were issued to restrict interactions, discouraging families from inviting prisoners of war into their residences. However, enforcement was inconsistent, and in numerous rural areas, such regulations were quietly disregarded. Life on the farm operated according to its own rhythms, far removed from the stringent oversight of military authorities. If a farmer desired to seat an exhausted prisoner at his table, there was little anyone could do to prevent it. The stories of these shared meals gradually became known beyond the farms. Clergy occasionally praised them as instances of Christian charity. Local gossip conveyed both admiration and criticism, disseminating tales of German soldiers assisting with milking cows or repairing furniture after dinner. For many within the community, it became a topic of quiet debate. Should mercy be extended to enemies, or did such gestures disrespect the pain of war? The prisoners of war themselves, however, harbored no doubts regarding the significance of these evenings. To them, each meal served as a reminder that humanity could endure even in captivity. And although they returned each night to barracks and barbed wire, those hours at American tables left an imprint deeper than the fences of their camps. Once hostilities ceased and the German war prisoners were transported back across the Atlantic Ocean, numerous individuals retained enduring recollections of the peculiar graciousness they encountered while in the United States. The agricultural landscapes eventually disappeared from sight, but the flavor of maize bread, fruit pastry, and pan-fried chicken remained ingrained in their memories long after the removal of the restrictive fencing. For the soldiers who had anticipated only tribulation during their period of confinement, those communal meals at American familial dining tables evolved into some of the most unforgettable narratives they related to their families following their return to their respective countries. Within modest German communities, veterans who had undergone American internment recounted stories with astonishment regarding the benevolence exhibited by the agricultural workers. They depicted circumstances in which, subsequent to extended periods laboring in the cultivated lands, they were not merely put up with, but were instead wholeheartedly embraced into domestic cooking spaces, provided with comparable comestibles as their custodians, and periodically regarded more as honored visitors rather than detainees. To a considerable number of listeners, these accounts proved challenging to harmonize with the extensive impairment Germany had sustained. Certain individuals expressed skepticism regarding their veracity, presuming them to be amplifications or outright falsehoods. Nevertheless, those individuals who had lived through the circumstances maintained conviction in the specifics. The fragrance of newly prepared baked goods, the merriment of offspring, the manner in which American landowners entrusted them with equipment, livestock, and even access to their residential abodes. Later investigations by historical scholars have substantiated that these instances of humanity exerted a durable influence on German standpoints of America. Certain former prisoners of war acknowledged that they had come back home with mitigated assessments of their erstwhile adversaries and even respect for the magnanimity they had witnessed. A limited quantity even endeavored to come back to the United States in the aftermath of the armed conflict, dispatching correspondence to the families who had at one time shared meals with them, with the aspiration of reconstructing existences within the territory where they had encountered unforeseen honor. As for the American agriculturalists, the reminiscences additionally persisted. Numerous individuals imparted tales to their offspring and posterity concerning the adolescent German individuals who toiled in their agricultural expanses, who grappled with the intricacies of the English language, yet engaged in spontaneous expressions of amusement once linguistic obstacles diminished, who seated themselves at their tables and inclined their heads in thankfulness ahead of partaking in their sustenance. For these individuals, the choice to partake in meals collectively did not epitomize a momentous political proclamation, but rather a straightforward affirmation of intrinsic decency, asserting that providing nourishment to the famished constituted a moral imperative, irrespective of whether the famished were clad in the uniform of the opposing military force. Naturally, the experience of such kindness was not universal among all captives, nor did every agriculturalist extend it. Persisting demarcation lines existed, engendered by apprehension, anguish, and resentment. Be that as it may, the heritage of those individuals who did unlock their abodes maintained potency precisely on account of its defiance of predilection. During a historical juncture when armed conflict mandated disunity, these agriculturalists elected to obscure the defined separations. Their actions functioned as a subdued form of opposition against antipathy, a gentle reminder that altruism was capable of enduring even amidst the direst of circumstances. During the subsequent years, personal narratives, documented dialogues, and regional chronological accounts safeguarded these depictions. A German prisoner of war might potentially reminisce concerning the coziness emanating from a lamp-illuminated culinary area, the gustatory sensation of unadulterated lactate, or the unpretentious act of being presented with an additional portion. An American agriculturalist might evoke the manner in which a detainee rectified his cultivating implement or fashioned an amusement device for his progeny. These recollections, notwithstanding their modest character, bore significant symbolic magnitude. They exemplified that warfare did not invalidate the prospect of benevolence, that notwithstanding the conflicts among nations, distinct individuals retained the capacity to elect an alternative course. For the individuals who experienced it firsthand, the heritage of communal repasts persevered as something transcending mere wistful sentimentality. It embodied an erudition indelibly imprinted upon recollection, affirming that humanity burgeons not within grandiloquent speeches or formal pacts, but rather within ordinary commonplace deeds, within bread conveyed across a counter, within pie divided with an unfamiliar person, within the fortitude to regard an adversary as a fellow being. Furthermore, concealed within that lesson resided the most genuine triumph, not that of military detachments, but rather that of compassion that endured beyond the duration of the armed conflict itself.